My 6-month-old baby girl was sleeping in her stroller on our front porch. She was holding her favorite soft toy and dreaming. It was a warm, quiet afternoon. Everything was peaceful and happy. Then Karen from the HOA came marching up our driveway. She was wearing thick rubber gloves and carrying a glowing green container. She looked furious. She started screaming that the stroller was clutter and was lowering the property value of the street. My baby woke up and started to cry. She was terrified by the loud, angry voice. This made Karen even more mad. She shouted, "I'll get rid of this trash once and for all." She opened the container and poured the glowing, steaming liquid right over my baby's legs. My daughter let out a scream of pure terror. She was shaking and wailing in pain as the liquid touched her skin. Tears streamed down her tiny face as she reached out her small hands, crying, "Wah! Daddy, help!" Karen stood at the bottom of the porch steps with her arms crossed. She had a cold, satisfied smile, like she had finally cleaned up the neighborhood. She had no idea that the man who just ran out of the house with a radiation detector was a nuclear engineer, and her father. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The afternoon was heavy with the kind of warmth that only comes in late June. It was a golden, syrupy light that seemed to make the world move a little slower, turning the neighborhood into a hazy, motionless portrait of suburban peace. I stood in my home office, the window open just enough to let in the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant, rhythmic chirping of a robin. The air was still, carrying that gentle silence that only exists when the rest of the world has decided to take a breath. My 6-month-old daughter, Lily, was sleeping in her stroller on the front porch. She was a tiny anchor that held my entire world in place, and from my desk, I could just see the top of the stroller's canopy through the screen door. I liked knowing she was there. I liked the steady, predictable nature of her naps. It was a perfectly balanced system, a QE interval in a life often governed by complex equations and high-stakes variables. As a nuclear engineer, my life is defined by monitoring baselines. I spend my days analyzing cooling systems, pressure gradients, and radiation levels, looking for the slightest deviation from the norm. But at home, the only baseline that mattered was the sound of Lily's breathing. It was a soft, whistling wraith that I had learned to listen for with more intensity than any reactor alarm. She was holding her favorite soft toy, a plush velvet rabbit with one floppy ear that had been through the wash more times than I could count. Her tiny fingers were curled loosely around its fur, her body completely relaxed in the deep, honest sleep of infancy. Everything was peaceful. Everything was quiet. It was the key of afternoon that felt safe. The kind of day where nothing bad was supposed to happen. I turned my attention back to my monitors, scrolling through a series of thermal readings from the plant. Even working from home, the mind of an engineer never truly powers down. I was checking the integrity of a secondary containment shield, looking for microscopic points of failure. The neighborhood outside was a postcard of order. The lawns were manicured to precise heights, the hedges were trimmed into uniform squares, and the silence was enforced by an unspoken agreement between neighbors. I appreciated that order. In my line of work, order is the difference between a productive day and a catastrophic event. I liked the predictability of our street, the way the shadows moved across the pavement at the same time every day. That was when I heard the footsteps. They weren't the casual, shuffling steps of a neighbor walking their dog. They were sharp, rhythmic, and heavy, striking the concrete of my driveway with a purposeful aggression that cut through the afternoon haze. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. I recognized that gait, the sound of someone who believed they owned every inch of ground they stepped on. I stood up slowly, my heart giving a small, instinctive thud against my ribs. I walked toward the window and pushed aside the blinds just enough to see the driveway. Karen was marching toward the house. She was the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, a woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws as if they were a sacred text and she was its only qualified interpreter. To Ka. N. A stray blade of grass was a sign of moral decay, and a non-compliant mailbox was a declaration of war. Usually, her fury was reserved for trash cans left out too long or the unsightly color of a neighbor's front door. But as she approached my porch, I saw a jagged edge to her posture that felt different, more volatile. She was wearing thick, heavy-duty rubber gloves. They were industrial GRD, the kind used for handling corrosive chemicals or high-voltage equipment. They looked absurdly out of place against her crisp, floral summer blouse. In her hands, she carried a container. It was a large, dense plastic jug, and even from the window I noticed something that made my professional instincts scream in warning. There was a faint, sickly green glow emanating from the liquid inside. Tea wasn't a reflection of the sun. It was an internal luminescence, a soft, pulsating light that suggested a chemical reaction or something far more unstable. I felt a cold chill wash over me, a sensation that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my office. My mind immediately began calculating possibilities, pH levels, isotopic markers, chemical compositions that could produce that specif. I see shade of chartreuse. Lily stirred in her sleep. The stroller squeaked slightly as she shifted, her tiny hand tightening around the plush rabbit. She was completely unaware of the storm that had just entered our driveway. Karen stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She didn't call out. She didn't knock. She just stood there with her hands on her hips, her face twisted into a mask of cold, company, concentrated fury. Her eyes were fixed on the stroller. She wasn't looking at the baby. She was looking at the clutter. To her, that stroller wasn't a vessel for a human life. It was a violation of paragraph 4, section B of the neighborhood standards. She looked at my daughter's sleeping form with the same clinical disdain she might show toward a pile of literal trash left on the curb. I reached F, or the door handle, my movements measured and calm, though my pulse was beginning to race. I intended to step out, greet her with a polite but firm smile, and move the stroller inside before she had a chance to wake Lily with her shouting. I had dealt with Karen before. I knew that the best way to handle her was with a lack of emotion, a professional distance that didn't give her the conflict she seemed to crave. But as I placed my hand on the cool metal of the latch, the air outside seemed to grow brittle. The peaceful humming of the birds stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden heavy tension that felt like the moment before a circuit breaks. Karen leaned forward, her shadow falling across the stroller, eclipsing the warm sunlight that had been resting on my daughter's face. I saw her the glowing container tighter, the thick rubber of her gloves creaking. Her mouth formed a thin, hard line of absolute resolve. The quiet of the afternoon was about to shatter, and no amount of engineering or containment could stop the reaction that had already been set in motion. Everything was quiet, but for the first time in my life, that silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like a count. Own. I pushed the screen door open, the hinges letting out a thin, high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate against the silence of the afternoon. The heat hit me instantly, a thick, humid blanket that smelled of sun-bleached wood and the impending storm. I stepped onto the porch, my eyes never leaving the large glowing container in Karen's hand. Up close, the fluorescence was even more unsettling. A vibrant, toxic chartreuse that seemed to pulse with an internal heat. "Karen," I said, my voice intentionally low and steady. I kept my hands visible, using the de-escalation posture I'd been taught during safety drills at the plant. "It's a bit hot for a surprise inspection, don't you think?" She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. She stood at the bottom of the steps, her heavy rubber glove squeaking as she shifted her grip on the heavy plastic jug. "I have sent 3 notices," she began, her voice a sharp, jagged edge that sliced through the quiet. 3 formal warnings about the clutter on this porch. You think the rules are suggestions, but they are the only thing keeping this street from becoming a slum. I glanced down at the stroller. It was a high-end model, clean and well maintained, tucked neatly into the corner of the porch out of the way of the stairs. To any rational person, it was a sign of a growing family. To Karen, it was a structural infection. "It's a stroller, Karen," I replied, trying to maintain the baseline. "My daughter is sleeping. We can talk about the bylaws tomorrow morning when I'm not on the clock." She took a step up, the wood of the porch groaning under her weight. Her eyes were glazed over with a fanatic intensity, the kind of absolute certainty that leaves no room for human empathy. "It's an eyesore," she spat, the word dripping with a strangely personal venom. "It brings down the property value of every house on this block. People drive by and they see this. They see sickness. They see weakness." I felt a flash of heat in my chest. That had nothing to do with the sun. I took a half step forward, positioning myself closer to Lily's stroller, my internal senses shifting from caution to threat detected. "You need to leave the property now," I said, the professional distance finally beginning to crumble. The tone of my voice had changed, and Karen felt it. The sudden shift in the air, the vibration of our voices, finally broke through Lily's sleep. I heard a small, sharp intake of breath from inside the stroller, the sound of a child waking up to a world that was suddenly too loud. Lily's eyes opened, wide and dark, reflecting the distorted image of the woman standing over her. She saw the furious mask of Karen's face, the strange green light of the container, and the aggressive posture of a stranger. She let out a small, confused whimper. It was a fragile sound, a request for comfort that was answered only by Karen's escalating rage. "Now look what you've done," Karen hissed, as if the baby's crying were a deliberate act of defiance. "The noise, the mess, it never ends with people like you." Lily's whimper turned into a full, terrified wail. She reached out her tiny hands, her fingers grasping at the air, looking for the safety of her father. Her face turned a bright, panicked red, tears flooding her cheeks instantly. The sound of my daughter's terror acted like a catalyst. Karen's face twisted into something no longer recognizable as human. The order she craved had been disrupted by the one thing she couldn't control: life. "I'll get rid of this trash once and for all," she screamed, her voice a ragged shriek that seemed to rattle the windows of the house. Before I could bridge the gap, before I could rip the container from her hands, she unscrewed the cap with a violent twist. A thick, acrid smell hit me. It smelled like ozone and heavy metals, a biting metallic scent that I knew from the high-security labs at work. She tipped the jug forward. A stream of the glowing, steaming liquid poured out in a viscous arc. It hit the fabric of the stroller first, a sickening hiss rising as the chemical reacted with the synthetic material. Then it reached Lily. My daughter let out a scream of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound so sharp it felt like it was tearing through my own lungs. The liquid splashed over her tiny legs, the steam rising in thick, sickly clouds as it touched her skin. She began to shake, her small body racking with wails of pain that I will hear for the rest of my life. The soft, velvet rabbit she had been holding was instantly soaked, turning a scorched, glowing green as the acid or isotope began its work. "Wah, Daddy, help!" Her voice broke into a series of jagged gasps, her tiny hands reaching out to me through the rising vapor. I froze for a split second. ND. My brain a chaotic storm of conflicting protocols. Part of me wanted to tackle Karen into the driveway, to crush the satisfaction out of her face. The other part, the engineer, was already triaging the liquid. The liquid wasn't just a chemical. It didn't just burn. It shimmered with a specific high-energy Serenkov-like glow. It was a waste product, something stolen or harvested, and I knew exactly what kind of damage it was doing on a cellular level. Karen stood at the bottom of the porch steps now, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had a cold, satisfied smile on her face, the expression of someone who had finally cleaned up a persistent stain on her perfect world. She looked at my screaming, scorched daughter and saw a job well done. She saw a return to the property value she held so dear. "There," she said, her voice eerily calm against the backdrop of my daughter's shrieks. "Now it's gone. Now the neighborhood can breathe again." I didn't waste another second on her. I spun around and sprinted back into the house, my boots sliding on the hardwood as I made a beeline for the heavy, lead-lined cabinet in my office. My heart was a frantic drum, but my hands were, suddenly, terrifyingly steady. I knew exactly what I was looking for. I knew exactly what the glowing meant. I grabbed the yellow handheld device, the digital display flickering to life as I tore it from its charging cradle. I didn't need to hear the first frantic clicks to know what I was dealing with. I burst back out onto the porch, the radiation detector held out like a weapon. Karen didn't. T-move. Her smile still firmly in place, but her life, and the life of this entire block, was about to change forever. I glanced at the screen, and the numbers I saw there confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't a local dispute anymore. This was a level 4 radiological event. The detector in my hand didn't just beep, it screamed. It was a jagged, electronic wail that sliced through the sound of Lily's cries, a frantic staccato of clicks that told me the air itself had become a hazard. The digital display was a blur of shifting digits, the numbers climbing with a terrifying velocity. 50 millisieverts. 100. The threshold for immediate radiation sickness was rushing toward us like a freight train. I didn't think about the heat or the sunlight anymore. I didn't even see the neighborhood. I saw the world in isotopes and half-lives, in the invisible fire that was currently eating into my daughter's skin. Lily's screams had shifted from a loud wail to a thin, ragged hitching sound. Her tiny lungs were working too hard, her chest heaving as the acrid metallic vapor from the glowing liquid filled the porch. I reached her in a single, desperate stride, my boots skidding through the edge of the teeming puddle on the porch floor. I didn't care about my own exposure, I only cared about the distance between her and the source. "I've got you, Lily," I whispered, though my voice was a harsh, unrecognizable rasp. "Daddy's here. I've got you." I scooped her out of the scorched stroller, being careful not to touch the areas where the liquid was still thick and glowing. Her clothes were melting, into the fabric of the seat, the synthetic fibers fused by the chemical heat. I turned my head and saw Karen. She was still standing there, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in a look of smug satisfaction. She looked at the screaming detector in my hand as if it were a noisy toy I was using to be dramatic. "That thing is just as loud and unsightly as the stroller," she barked, her voice full of an entitlement that had finally curdled into madness. "I told you to clean up. I'm just helping you follow the rules." I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her face. To me, she wasn't a neighbor or a woman anymore. She was a biological threat that needed to be contained. I sprinted back into the house, kicking the door shut behind me with a force that rattled the frame. I needed a controlled environment. I needed a way to stop the reaction before it reached her bone marrow. The hallway felt miles long, the familiar photos on the walls blurring into a frantic streak of color as I ran. Lily was so small in my arms, her trembling body radiating a heat that shouldn't have been there. I burst into the guest bathroom and slammed the door, sealing us inside. I turned on the fan and the shower, the sound of rushing water competing with the relentless high-pitched alarm of the radiation detector. I stripped her clothes off with shaking hands, being careful to pull the contaminated fabric away from her face. Every second the material touched her skin, more of the isotope was being absorbed. The skin on her legs was a bright, angry red, the texture already beginning to change. I felt a cold, sharp blade of ice twist in my gut, but I forced the father in me to stay back. I needed the engineer right now. I began the decontamination protocol, using the cool water to flush the area, letting the runoff go straight down the drain. It was a crude solution, but it was the only one I had. As the water hit her, Lily's cries intensified, a sharp, broken sound that threatened to shatter my resolve. I kept talking to her, my voice a low, steady drone of reassurance that I didn't actually feel. "Stay with me, Lily. Just a little longer, sweetheart. You're doing so good. Daddy's here." I grabbed my phone with one hand while holding her upright under the stream with the other. My fingers were slick with water and fear, but I dialed the one number that bypassed the local dispatch. "This is an emergency radiological report," I said, my voice snapping into a clipped, professional tone that I had used 1,000 times in drills. "Site location, 42 Oak Street. We have a level 4 release of an unidentified high-activity isotope." The operator on the other end didn't ask for a name. They didn't ask for a description of the clutter. They heard the detector screaming in the background and the weight in my voice. "Units are already being diverted," they said. "Estimated time of arrival, 4 minutes. Secure the perimeter." Outside the bathroom door, I could hear the muffled sounds of the neighborhood reacting. There were shouts, the sound of running footsteps, and then the unmistakable rising wail of sirens in the distance. I heard Karen's voice again, raised in an indignant "Defen." Sieve shriek. She was arguing with someone on the sidewalk, her words a frantic blur of HOA bylaws and property values. She didn't understand that she had just turned our quiet cul-de-sac into an exclusion zone. She didn't understand that the trash she tried to get rid of was now the center of a federal investigation. The bathroom grew smaller, filled with the steam from the shower and the franti. See light of the detector. The red and blue flashes from the arriving cruisers began to bounce off the tile, turning our sanctuary into a blur of frantic color. There was a thunderous pounding at the front door, followed by a series of heavy, authoritative commands. "Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Department of Energy. Clear the hallway." I didn't move. I didn't stop the water. I held Lily close, watching the numbers on the detector finally, slowly, begin to plateau. The door to the bathroom burst open, and suddenly the room was full of figures in heavy lead-lined suits and respirators. They moved with a clinical, terrifying purpose, their masks reflecting the flashing lights from the window. "We've got her, sir," one of them said, his voice muffled by the breathing apparatus. "We'll take ov. The wash. Step back." I let them take her, but I didn't go far. I stood in the doorway, my hands still wet, my chest tight with a panic that was only starting to loosen its grip. Through the open door of the house, I could see Karen. She was standing in the yard, her face pale, her hands trembling as an officer in a hazmat suit directed a sensor toward her. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning realization that her rules had no power here. The click of the radiation detector was the only sound in the hallway, a rhythmic reminder that the world had changed. The rescue was over, but the fallout was just beginning. The street no longer looked like a neighborhood. It had been transformed into something clinical and terrifying, a landscape of high-visibility yellow and cold, flashing lights, yellow caution. Radiation tape was being stretched across my driveway, creating a jagged boundary that separated my life from the rest of the world. Heavy vehicles, some unmarked, others bearing the seal of the Department of Energy, now lined the curb where ice cream trucks usually parked. The air was no longer filled with the scent of summer grass. It was heavy with the smell of ozone and the sharp chemical tang of the specialized foam being used to neutralize the glowing puddle on my porch. Lily was gone. I had watched them carry her away in a specialized, lead-lined transport isolette. The sight of her tiny form, surrounded by thick shielding and monitored by men in respirators, was a vision that would never leave my mind. She was being taken to a high-level radiological trauma unit, a place where the air was filtered and the doctors wore badges that measured the invisible fire they fought every day. I couldn't go with her yet. I was part of the scene, a witness and a potential casualty. I stood on the side. Walk. My hands still stinging from the decontamination wash. An officer in a heavy, charcoal-colored suit approached me, his face hidden behind a gold-tinted visor. "Sir, we need you to stay within the perimeter," he said, his voice sounding hollow and metallic through his external speakers. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the porch. The clutter Karen had hated so much was now being treated as a biohazard. My daughter's stroller was being dismantled by a robotic arm, its pieces dropped into thick, shielded barrels. Across the street, the neighbors had gathered. They stood in small, frightened clusters, their hands over their mouths as they watched the nightmare unfold in their quiet cul-de-sac. I could see the shift in their expressions, from confusion to a dawning absolute horror. They weren't looking at the property values anymore. They were looking at a man-made disaster. Then there was Karen. She was standing near the back of a police cruiser, her thick rubber gloves still on her hands, glowing faintly in the afternoon shadows. She looked rigid and defensive, her chin tilted up as if she could still argue her way out of this with a copy of the HOA bylaws. 2 officers were nenning her with long-handled Geiger counters, the rapid clicking audible even from where I stood. "This is an overreaction," I heard her shout, her voice thin and desperate against the hum of the emergency generators. "I was just cleaning up the street. You have no right to treat me like this." The officers didn't answer her. They didn't even look at her face. They were focused on the numbers on Teach EIR screens, numbers that were likely confirming her role in the fallout. One of the lead investigators, a man in a crisp suit that seemed out of place among the hazmat gear, stepped toward her. He held a tablet displaying the security footage from my front door. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any heat. "We've recovered the container. It contains high-activity industrial WA. Stay. Specifically, a cobalt-60 isotope derivative." Karen scoffed, though her face had gone the color of ash. "I don't care what you call it. It was a mess. The rules are clear about unauthorized storage on porches." The investigator didn't blink. "You poured a lethal radiological source onto a 6-month-old child because of a neighborhood rule?" Karen crossed her arms, a cold, satisfied smile flick, carrying across her lips for a fleeting second before she realized no one was impressed. Someone had to take charge. "This neighborhood has standards." I felt a surge of cold fury that made my vision blur at the edges. I took a step toward her, but the officer beside me placed a heavy, gloved hand on my shoulder. "Let the process work, sir," he said. "The facts are enough. They're more than enough." He was right. The facts weren't just on paper. They were in the air, in the soil, and in the cells of my daughter's body. This wasn't a dispute about a stroller. It was a criminal act of radiological endangerment. The investigation team was now moving toward the fence line, their sensors sweeping every inch of the yard. I watched as they flagged the area where Karen had marched up the driveway, arcing her footsteps like they were tracking a predator. A specialized transport truck pulled up, its thick lead doors swinging open to receive the contaminated stroller and the scorched rabbit toy. The items that had once represented Lily's comfort were now evidence in a federal case. I looked at the house, my home, and realized it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a command center, a place where P.E. Opalin suits would spend the next several weeks measuring the damage Karen had done in a single minute of rage. Karen was finally being guided toward a transport vehicle, her movements stiff and uncoordinated. She looked around at the neighbors, searching for a single face that would offer her support. She found none. The people she claimed to be protecting were looking at her with an unmistakable loathing. They weren't her community anymore. They were the people whose lives she had put at risk for the sake of a perfect lawn. As the doors of the cruiser closed on her, the afternoon light began to fade, casting long skeletal shadows across the street. The quiet had returned, but it was a heavy, poisoned silence. I sat down on the curb, my head in my hands, listening to the rhythmic click. King of the sensors. The exclusion zone was set, and for the first time in my life, I understood that real power didn't come from a clipboard. It came from the truth, and the truth was currently being measured in sieverts. The interrogation room was a sterile, windowless box that smelled of industrial floor wax and stale burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, persistent vibration that seemed to burrow into the base of my skull. I sat in a heavy metal chair, my hands resting flat on the table. They were still red from the scrub, a physical reminder of the poison I had washed off my daughter's skin only hours before. Across from me, Karen sat huddled in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too large for her. The thick rubber gloves had been confiscated and sealed in a lead-lined evidence bag, leaving her hands looking strangely pale and skeletal. She wasn't screaming anymore. The fire that had driven her up my driveway had been replaced by a brittle, defensive stillness. She stared at the table as if the scratches in the metal held the secret to her defense. "I've already told the other men," she murmured, her voice thin and raspy. "I was Jay. Enforcing the standards. There were notices. You can't say there weren't notices." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, watching the way her eyes darted toward the heavy steel door every time a shadow passed the frosted glass. "This isn't about notices, Karen," I said finally. My voice was flat, devoid of the heat she expected. "This is about where you found that container." She scoffed, a ghost of her former arrogance flickering in the corners of her mouth. "It was in the basement of my late husband's old workshop. He did industrial cleaning. It was just a bottle of solvent." I leaned forward, the metal chair creaking under my weight. It wasn't solvent. It was a high-activity cobalt-60 source used for industrial radiography. It was marked with a trefoil, the internet. "Ional symbol for radiation?" Karen shook her head quickly, her fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the table. "It was just green. I thought it was special, efficient. I thought it would clean the sick smell off your porch." The sheer, staggering ignorance of her statement made the air in the room feel thin. She had treated a lethal isotope as a cleaning product because she didn't like the SI. Of a stroller. The lead investigator, a man named Miller from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, stepped into the room. He didn't look at Karen. He looked at me, nodding once before sliding a thick manila folder onto the table. "We've finished the preliminary audit of the HOA records," Miller said. His voice was clinical, the sound of a man who dealt in facts rather than feelings. He opened folder and spread several documents across the table. They were emails, printed in chronological order, many of them signed with Karen's distinctive looping signature. It turns out 42 Oak Street wasn't the only property Karen was monitoring, Miller continued. He tapped a photograph of a house 3 blocks away. I looked at the image. It showed a small ramp leading to a front door, a tidy structure that had been defaced with the same glowing green liquid. "This was the Thompson family," Miller explained. "They have a son with muscular dystrophy. Karen filed 14 complaints in 6 months about their non-conforming entrance. I felt a cold, sharp stone settle in my stomach. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a campaign." Karen finally looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "They were ruining the uniform look of the street. People move here for the aesthetic. I was protecting their investment." Miller ignored her, sliding another document forward. "And then there was the Lopez family. They had a specialized medical van. Karen tried to have it towed 4 times because it exceeded the commercial vehicle height limit." I looked at Karen, For the first time, I didn't see a neighbor or a villain. I saw a point of failure in a system that had allowed her to believe her preferences were law. "You weren't enforcing standards, Karen," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the room. "You were hunting. You were looking for anything that reminded you that life isn't perfect." Karen's jaw tightened, the muscles jumpy. Beneath her skin, "I kept that neighborhood safe. I kept it clean. No one else had the courage to tell people like you that your needs are an eyesore." The investigator sighed and closed the folder with a final heavy thud. The sound echoed like a gavel. "The NRC is filing federal charges for the illegal possession and dispersal of radioactive material." Karen blinked, the word federal fee, Nally seeming to pierce through the armor of her entitlement. "But I'm on the board. I have seniority. The board held an emergency session an hour ago," Miller replied. "They've dissolved the current leadership and issued a formal statement of cooperation with the Department of Justice." The color drained from Karen's face so completely that she looked like a wax figure. The structure she had built her identity around The hierarchy, the rules, the power had collapsed. "They can't do that," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm the one in charge." "You were never in charge, Karen," I said, standing up from the table. "You were just a neighbor who forgot that the rules were made for the people, not the other way around." I walked toward the door, my boots clicking on the linoleum. I didn't need to hear her excuses anymore. The evidence was in the isolette at the hospital and in the exclusion zone on Oak Street. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Karen was staring at the manila folder, her hands trembling as the reality of a life-term federal sentence finally began to settle in. "Lily is going to recover," I said, the words feeling like a weight leaving my chest. "But you're going to spend the rest of your life in a room that looks exactly like this, one that's perfectly standard." I stepped out into the hallway and let the heavy door swing shut. The click of the lock was a final, satisfying sound, a definitive end to the chaos she had invited into our lives. The hallway was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. It was a sterile, orderly silence, the kind Karen would have loved if she weren't the one being contained by it. I walked toward the exit, my mind already racing ahead to the hospital, to the long road of recovery that Lily faced. The point of failure had been identified and isolated. Now the healing cow. Begin. The hospital room was a world of white and stainless steel, far removed from the yellow tape and sirens of Oak Street. The air here was filtered and pressurized, humming with the quiet efficiency of machines that monitored every heartbeat and every breath. Lily lay in a specialized pediatric bed, her small frame dwarfed by the complexity of the medical equipment surrounding her. Her legs were wrapped in clean white dressings, but the frantic, high-pitched alarm of the radiation detector was finally silent. Her color had returned, her cheeks a soft pink under the gentle glow of the observation lights. She was sleeping, her tiny hands still curled around the new sterilized plush rabbit the nursing staff had provided. I sat beside her bed, watching the slow, even rise and fall of chest. For the first time in days, my own breathing had synchronized with hers, the crushing weight of the exclusion zone finally beginning to lift from my lungs. Earlier that afternoon, the deputy commissioner had visited. He didn't come with a clipboard or a list of violations. He came with a folder of finalized reports and a quiet, heavy respect. The legal fallout for Karen was absolute. Because she had used an industrial isotope, the charges had been escalated to the federal level, bypassing the local HOA disputes she had once used as a weapon. The evidence provided by the neighbors, the videos, the recordings, and the shared history of her targeting the vulnerable, had created a mountain of truth that no amount of seniority could climb. Karen wasn't just removed from the board, she was prohibited by a permanent protective order from ever entering the neighborhood again. I looked out the hospital window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I knew that back on Oak Street, the world was already correcting itself. The HOA had sent a formal letter to every resident, not to announce a new rule, but to offer a sincere apology. They were adopting new guidelines rooted in accessibility and compassion, ensuring that medical equipment, ramps, and strollers would never again be viewed as clutter. My neighbors had stepped into the light as well. They had stopped whispering behind curtains and started looking out for one another, realizing that a neighborhood's value isn't measured in property prices, but in the safety of its children. Safety was no longer just a routine or a lack of danger for us. It was something earned through protection and the firm application of justice. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she looked toward me. She didn't flinch, and she didn't scream. She saw my face and offered a small, tired smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice finally clear of the acrid vapor of the isotope. "I'm right." "Here," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "You're safe. We're going home soon." As she drifted back into a peaceful sleep, I understood that power without empathy is a fragile thing that eventually collapses under its own weight. Real authority, the kind that matters, is the quiet resolve to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The sirens were gone. The glowing liquid had been neutralized. The rules had been rewritten to include humanity. The rescue was complete. The consequences were final. And for the first time since that warm, quiet afternoon, the air felt clean again.